be doing notes on the legacies of the Civil War. We talked about this last time with our notes, that we said who won the Civil War, just the fighting, the North. But last time when we did Reconstruction, we brought up who really won Reconstruction. The South, because what will not be enforced for the next 100 years? What amendments? 13th, 14th, and 15th. And the South basically went back to what it was before the Civil War. So our notes are fill in the blank today, so I'm going to let you fill in the blanks, and I'm going to discuss a little bit after you fill in your blanks. So here's our first one. So one of the big things that we talked about is the South going back exactly to what it was socially. But if it's going to go back to the same social structure, it kind of means that they're going to go back to the same economic structure. And so we will see the South still remain primarily agrarian. We will see the Freedmen's Bureau, which you saw in your black codes, that was supposed to redistribute land to African Americans, 40 acres and a mule, won't actually be able to do that. They do settle some African Americans back on the land, but people who reside on the land will have issues that get it. And so I need to give you an example of sharecropping and tenant farming, but I need someone to be a plantation owner. Who's going to be my plantation owner? Hey, Nick, raise his hand first, sorry. So Nick's our plantation owner, and we were all formerly his slaves. So what did the 13th Amendment do to him? It freed y'all, hooray, right? But what did he lose? A lot of money, and he lost his labor. So does Nick have anybody to tend to his land anymore? No. And y'all know from question 3 on the study guide that many African Americans, they flee the plantation, right? They go look for their lost loved ones. They go take on new names. They leave. But when harvest time, when planting time comes around, is Nick in a pickle? Is he in trouble? Why is he in trouble? He has no one to work on his land. So there's 2 types of ways that Nick will get people to work on his land. First is sharecropping. What he does, he goes to all his former slaves. First, like Emmanuel, right next door to him. He's like, look, you work the land, you have skills. Let's sharecrop. And he says, look, I'll give you 100 acres. When harvest time comes up, you must share your crop with me. You must give me 60% of that crop. Does this at least give Emmanuel a job? Does it at least give him something that he has ownership over later? The 40% of the crop. So does Emmanuel and other slaves go into sharecropping? But what does this sound like again? Slavery is just by a different name. So this is what Nicholas and a lot of other plantation oligarchy people do. So by World War I and World War II, we're going to see about 75% of African Americans are still tied to the land, either through sharecropping or tenant farming. So let me explain tenant farming. Okay? Jose does not want to share his crop. He's like, look, I'll pay you for that land. And he becomes a tenant. He will pay rent on that land that belongs to Nick. But when harvest time comes, does Jose give any of his crop to Nick? No, because he's been paying him what? So by World War I and World War II, many African Americans are going to be tied to this. But you have to understand, is Nick giving them the seed? Is he giving them the tools to be on that land? So they often have to go to the feed store or the seed store or the co-op store. So do y'all know in downtown Waxahachie where the train is? The train depot? There's that seed place right across. It's something with a B. Boys.
And
Ark's there too?
No, Ark's
Ark's is down here on 77, right? So if you have 2 different options. So if you were farming at this time and you were either sharecropping and tenant farming, you needed to go to the feed store, seed store, or the co-op. to be able to get your seeds, to be able to get your equipment. But do you think Emmanuel and Jose had that money at that time? So they would often take out credit. And they would get credit, and this is the crop lien system, that they promised the merchants that they would pay them back with 50 to 60% interest. Is that a lot of interest? And if they did not take it, they could seize their crop. So Emmanuel, how much crop did he have to give to Nick? And now he can't pay the seed place, so what do they take from him? The 40%. Does he have anything? Jose can't pay them back because he's been paying rent. So the merchants take his whole crop. Does this keep the African Americans tied to the land and in perpetual debt? And so this is why we see many landowners, either through sharecropping, tenant farming, are going to be in debt, and they're going to have taxes to pay. So does this maintain the same social order? So did the South change much? The one way it will change is through industrialization, which is on our next slide. So I'm going to let you copy these things down. With the abolishment of slavery by the 13th Amendment, what has just happened to the labor pool in the South? Has it increased the competition between landless whites and former slaves? So what happens when there's competition with people who are working? The wages go down, and so many northern industrialists look at the South as a viable area to bring industrialization. They see first off the cheap labor. Second, they see if we locate down south, we're closer to the cotton and produce the cotton textiles. And also many southern states are attracting through them through lower taxes. So that's one form of industrialization that happens in the South. The second one is through Duke. Y'all probably know Duke University. Yeah, you probably heard about them in the news this weekend. They lost to SFA. Yeah. Yes.
On TikTok.
Huh? It was on TikTok.
A lot of the players are dumb.
Really? I had no clue what TikTok was.
I'll show you.
Okay. But Duke made his fortune, which will lead to him being a philanthropist, which will lead to Duke University being named after him because he will bankroll that university. But Duke made his millions, and we're going to get into an age of millionaires, which we're going to talk about after the Civil War and Reconstruction test. Duke made his millions by creating the cigarette rolling machine. Okay? And so we're going to see he has a process over this, and eventually we will see universities be created after the like minds of very rich men. The next thing I have to talk about is the iron and steel industry coming down south. With iron and steel, that means we could build the railroads. But I want you to think what it is to work in an iron and steel mill. Is it hot? Is it hard work? Do you think many people want to work in these steel mills? And so one of the stories I always tell my students is that you have to understand when you get out of the steel mill and people are walking outside of the mill and their shoes are hitting the ground, every time they squish their foot, sweat is coming out of their shoe. Hey, do y'all want to work in a place like that? No. And so it is hard to get people to work in the iron and steel mills. So what happens is that a lot of people who are in prison begin to work at the iron and steel mills. Because y'all have to understand, are there people who are getting in trouble for violating laws in the South? Who do you think a majority of these people are? African Americans, because what are they violating? What are some laws that they're probably violating? Black coats, they're getting arrested, right? Jim Crow laws, they're getting arrested. Do you think they're getting arrested for being in debt? And so they're getting put in jail. And y'all have to understand, what does it mean to be put in jail? Because do y'all know that there's different punishments between rich people and poor people? Because when people go to jail, it is called capital punishment. You could get out of jail if you give the capital. What does that mean? The money, right? So people like, have you heard of the Varsity Blue scandals? All those rich kids that their parents were buying their way through college. Are they doing much time? No, because what are they giving? The capital. If you do not have the money, what do you give? The time. And so our prisons are filling up in the South because people are violating the black codes and Jim Crow laws. What specific ethnic group is it? African Americans. And so now the prisons are full, and one of the ways that the prisons get people to pay off their capital is they then rent them out to industries. Do we have an industry here desperate for workers? Do you think they're going to be very careful with the lives of these workers here? And this is what's going to perpetuate the criminal justice system in the South. Does this sound like slavery by another name? Yes. And this is going to be, I think y'all are going to read Just Mercy in Miss Huskinson and Miss Scott's class. Have they told you all that yet? No, I think it's like Trevor Noah and then Just Mercy soon. But that sets up why the criminal justice system was created in the South, because of the violations of the black codes and Jim Crow laws. And then we can look at the criminal justice system today, that the highest incarceration of a minority group today is of African Americans. And it all stems back to workers needed here, violation of the Jim Crow and black codes. Okay, we talked about the railroads. Again, even though the South industrialized, it's only going to contribute 10% to the industrial growth of America. And many of this financing came from northern millionaires who made their money by making shoddy goods during the Civil War. Okay, there's two things we're going to write here. We're going to talk about the creation of, I don't know if you've ever heard about the historically black colleges before. Have y'all heard of historically black colleges before? No? Okay. Some people, yes. Like y'all know there's Harvard, right? And there's equivalent to Harvard for African Americans. It's called Howard University. Have you ever heard of Howard? Okay. How many of y'all have all heard of Texas A&M? And it is the first university in the state of Texas. But when the federal government gave the money for Texas A&M, it said it also must make a black college. Does anybody know the black equivalent to Texas A&M? Texas A&M Prairie View. Have you heard of Texas A&M Prairie View? No, none of y'all ever heard of Texas A&M Prairie View. It's a historically black college that is the A&M second campus. Okay, many of y'all know of UT. Do y'all know of UT's black school? Houston Tillotson. It's actually on the other side of 35 from the football stadium. Okay, most of y'all don't know that a lot of white schools have black colleges. And there's a reason for black colleges, and you have to understand the white and black city. Okay, many of y'all don't know that many of our major cities were white only towns because they had dusk laws. I don't know if you know what dusk laws were, but when dusk hit, African Americans could not be found in the city. Did African Americans have to go into the city to work? Yes, because they were often in the service industry. But after dusk, should they be found in those cities? So surrounding major cities like Oklahoma City, which was the most notorious for dusk laws, they had to live in surrounding cities. So how many of you know Oklahoma City, and there's Edmond, Oklahoma? Edmond is where all the tornadoes hit all the time. That was a historically black city. And within this black city, we're going to see middle-class African Americans rise up, but they're going to be going to the historically black colleges and institutes that were created. Because at this time, because of Jim Crow, a white nurse and a white doctor could not perform any task on an African American. So when we get to the civil rights after spring break, we're going to see African Americans openly harmed in the streets. And could they go to the hospitals that white people were seen at? No. And so they would often get rendered care in churches. And so because of our segregated society that will come out from Plessy versus Ferguson, black colleges needed to arise so that the African American community could provide for itself. And so we're going to see that education is going to be segregated at this time, but these black colleges are created. But before those black colleges are created, there's going to be institutes such as Tuskegee. Many of you probably have heard of Tuskegee because you've probably heard of the Tuskegee Airmen, okay, which was the first black fighting group in combat in World War II. Well, the Tuskegee Institute is an area that they just teach technical skills. And we're going to see two different brainchilds come out of this period about collegiate education versus institute education, which we'll get more to when I get to my progressives. But do you all understand why education came out for African Americans? Okay. It's because of Jim Crow. You're going to do a reading on this today, but I'm going to let you copy this stuff down. I don't know if y'all know where the word Jim Crow comes from, but you're going to be doing a reading on it today. Jim Crow is actually a name for a character that was a minstrel show character who wore blackface. Y'all probably heard of blackface recently in the news, right? That's when someone who is non-black puts on blackface on, right? And it's considered taboo today, right? But back then, Jim Crow was the name of a white minstrel character who put blackface on. And so this is where the law gets its name. And what occurs to lead to Jim Crow is actually a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy is 7/8 white and 1/8 black. So what is he? He's mixed, yes. Okay. He doesn't have a pure pedigree, but what would he be considered? Colored, yes. Black, okay. He would not be considered fully white, right?
But would he look fully white?
He does. But he is African American. So Homer Plessy, there is a rule in Louisiana on the railroad carts that if you're white, you can only go to the white cart. If you're black, you have to go to the black cart. Well, Homer Plessy, who's 7/8 white, tries to challenge this. And he tries to get on what car? The white car. And he's denied admission, and he has a case that will go to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court will say that as long as separate accommodations are provided and they're equal, it is okay to segregate the races. And it is this case that leads to Jim Crow laws all around the South, basically all through the South for African Americans. Even in Texas, it's between whites and Mexicans. When we go to California, same thing, whites, Mexicans, and Asians. So Plessy versus Ferguson is eventually going to lead to the desegregation of society, okay? The next thing is the 15th Amendment, which was supposed to garner the right to vote for African Americans. So the first thing is a poll tax. This is equivalent to a day's worth of work. So let's just imagine the minimum wage today is $8, and you work 8 hours a day. How much is that? $64. That's how much you would have to pay to vote. How many of y'all would be willing to do that today? $64 to vote. No, not a lot of people. But who do you think that keeps out from voting? Minorities, right? All across the board, even immigrants who are coming into this nation. The next one is a literacy test. This one requires that you go to the registrar and be able to show that you could vote. You have to realize that these laws have not been off the books for very long. The poll tax went away in 1965. Hey, my mom, her first year voting, had to pay for this. The literacy test went away in 1964. My mom took this. Do you think people were discriminated against? Yes, the lady in front of her was white. Mary had a little lamb. My mom went up there, she had Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution. Do you think it was administered fairly? Hey, the next one, we could all do this one. Raise your hand if you had a grandparent who has voted in the United States. Guess what? You pass the grandfather clause and you get a vote. If you didn't raise your hand, you don't get to vote. So I want you to think of many African Americans at this time. Did many African Americans have grandfathers who were able to vote in the United States? Looking at these laws, whose rights are they infringing on? colored people, right? African Americans in the South, but is this preventing them from having their rights? Eventually, when we come back from spring break, we are going to come right back to this because this is what the civil rights movement is going to be about. The last thing is we know through the Congressional Plan number 2 that the Ku Klux Klan comes out, right? And they're going to be terrorizing African Americans, trying to prevent them from voting. And one of the biggest things that was happening was lynching. And Ida B. Wells will write a book about the lynchings. There's about, on average, 187 reported lynchings within a year. That's reported to the police department. But do you think most lynchings were reported? She's calculated that over 1,000 within a year were happening in the South. So we're going to look at Grant's administration. So we're going to see the Republican Party is going to be highly tied to the businesses because they're going to support a high tariff. Also, just like what you did in your reading on the black man and the Republican Party, the black man and the 15th Amendment, the African American is going to be tied to the Republican Party, which seems weird today because we know most African Americans vote Democratic, and we'll talk about that shift to them to the Democratic Party when we get to the civil rights movement. Another thing that happens at this time is political scandal. Political machines are using the vote from African Americans and immigrant groups by mainly promising them stuff in exchange for their vote. We also see the spoil system where politicians are getting their friends into politics, but are they the best? Okay. So I'm going to explain the credit mobilier scandal. The credit mobilier scandal deals with the Union Pacific. You have to understand that the Union Pacific is a management company. It's not a construction company. And so it is going to get federal government money to make the railroad. So there's bids that go in. A bid is the lowest bid. B bid is the middle bid. C bid is the highest bid. If they're using federal government money to build this railroad, which bid should they take? A. Why should they take the lowest? It's the cheapest, right? It's taxpayer money. But they take the C bid. Does that make sense? No, and this is the credit mobilier. The credit mobilier was the highest bid to build the railroad. But it turns out the directors who are on the Union Pacific are also the directors of the credit mobilier. So why did they do that? So they could get the money. Did they overcharge? Is this now going to be a scandal? And this is what we're going to start looking in the political era of the Gilded Age, the political scandal. Another thing, the government is going to stop inflation by requiring all paper money to be redeemed in gold, which we've seen before. Remember that you used to be able to take up the money and get gold in exchange. The U.S. buys Alaska for $7.2 million, and I'll show you a video why we buy it, because there's rumor stuff there. Many of y'all didn't have the rumor stuff there, but what do you think we're going to find in Alaska? Oil and gold, and that's the rumor. So everybody makes fun of Seward because they think it's just an icebox. Eventually, we're going to talk about Midway when we get to World War II and why it was so important we got it. Don't worry about the Alabama. We talked about the Ku Klux Klan coming in, and under the Grant administration, they do the Ku Klux Klan Acts that try to prevent the Klan from redeeming power. So there's two things why Reconstruction ends. One of the reasons is something that y'all learned last year in world history. Y'all remember social Darwinism? This social Darwinism, this idea is going to take hold at this time, that the fit will survive and the weak will die out. And because of this philosophy at this time, many people began to say, well, why are we giving extra protection to the people who necessarily don't need it? And the government backs out, and they're saying if African Americans are strong enough, they will garner their rights on their own. It is this, along with industrialization and immigration and westward expansion, that will eventually be the guiding principles of why Reconstruction ends, along with that 1876 election we talked about. Remember that last time? We're just going to go into a little bit more detail of this. Remember, Hayes didn't receive the most votes in the Electoral College. Tilden was one shy of winning, but we had 3 states that had turned in double ballots. Can you have double ballots in the Electoral College? So there's a commission that was set up by the Electoral College Act to look at the disputed electoral votes in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. This commission, was it set up fairly? No, there was 15 people. How many Republican? 8, 7 Democrats. Who did they decide to give the election to? And the South felt cheated. So in negotiation, Hayes wins the election, federal troops are removed. By removing those federal troops, whose rights for the next 100 years will not be garnered, will be sacrificed? African Americans. Okay? And they also get other things such as the Postmaster General and internal improvements. And so once those federal troops move out, who comes back? What group of people come back? The Klan comes back, right? We also see the Redeemers come back, and they pardon those ex-Confederate leaders. The Redeemers come back, and those federal troops have been removed, and we will see the South will be solidly Democratic, because will African Americans be protected with their rights to vote? No. And we see that Congress, according to the 14th Amendment, was supposed to come in and protect African Americans. But what has now happened to the South and their representation in Congress? What has happened to the South and the representation in Congress because of the 3/5 compromise is gone? They have more seats. They have 12 more seats. So will Congress be able to come down south if the South has 12 more seats? The South will be prevented from getting any assistance because the Southerners will prevent Congress from coming in. And we will see that we will return to the same ruling class in the South that we saw in the antebellum period, and they will reverse a lot of the progressive reforms that were done during Reconstructions, such as the starting of schools, the building of railroads, and the building of infrastructure.